When I was first asked to speak, I thought, what on earth do you say in 40 minutes about a district you know so well? And it really is a tall order. So I've decided I'm going to try and pick out a few salient points about East Torrens. What makes it different? Why is it different from other areas of the state? And I'm going to do this by firstly introducing you to the area. I guess a lot of you are familiar with the locality, and then run through some slides which pick up various aspects of the district. The area that I'm going to talk about as East Torrens is in essence what we know now as the District Council of East Torrens. The original East Torrens area, which dated as a local government area from 1853, actually extended from the River Torrens east to the Onkaparinga River. So it was a very large area. And as a local government area, it lasted in that dimension until 1856, when it was split into pieces. And the councils you now know as Burnside and Campbelltown and Payneham were all split off, and also District Council of Onkaparinga took part of the area. So for the most part, I'm going to concentrate on what is now, and has been since 1856, East Torrens. I will comment a bit about the overlap into the suburban areas of Campbelltown and Burnside, not a lot, but also the District Council of Onkaparinga, because there were some ties, and from a historical point of view, the presence of the Onkaparinga Valley was quite important in the development of East Torrens. Okay, what's the area I'm talking about? So East Torrens encompasses 117 square kilometres of country. It's not square, I might add, anything but. And the townships, as you can see, with Burnside and Magill being the eastern foothills areas, and the townships that comprise East Torrens being Norton Summit, Ashton, Summertown, Uradla, Piccadilly, Kerrigully, Basket Range, Cherryville and Montacute. Marble Hill, of course, is a locality more than a township, and Castanbull, which is right on the River Torrens. If you're familiar with country districts of South Australia, they had nice, neat 80-acre sections, or perhaps larger, and they were very much on a grid system. East Torrens is anything but, and that is part of the point that I want to make about the development of the district. It's undulating country. It's made up of a huge number of sections, which range literally from, in acres, from about 15 up to 100. And the area is, as you'll see by the next overhead, dissected by creeks. So it's a very dissected bit of country, and that made getting around on it not very easy. It also made getting into it not very easy. Marble Hill, which is actually on what I call the Ashton Ridge, for many years it was probably better known as the New Tiers. Basket Range is an actual range with a township partway along it, and Forest Range is really the eastern boundary of East Torrens. Once you go over Forest Range, you're in the flatter, or somewhat flatter country of Forest Range, and that then goes through to Lenswood and then the Onkaparinga Valley. And the country's progressively getting less hilly and flatter. So East Torrens is very much the steep, undulating, dissected by creeks country. Annual average rainfall in inches ranges from about 41 to 45 inches, so it's pretty wet. A lot of water, both in creeks and from underground. One thing I will comment on, well, I've got this here. When Hamish asked me to speak, he said, don't be afraid to say something about your own family. And I was actually going to try and do the whole talk around what our family's involvement has been with the district. The bishop settled at Norton Summit in 1851. In 1871, we bought this property at Basket Range, and we've since added to it. And the land we currently own is shaded in blue. They've been orchardists all that time, and I'll come back to that right at the very end. The European settlement of East Torrens dates from the late 1830s. Going back a bit, the Aboriginal history of East Torrens is very much a question mark, and I've spoken to a number of people about this. I think they were probably sensible and kept well out of the hills. It was too wet and cold. Why come to a place where you couldn't see through it because of the forest? And obviously in winter it was pretty cold and damp. To my knowledge, there's been no Aboriginal artefacts found in the district that are of local origin. There have been a few that have been brought in from the Palmer district, but nothing much else. So European settlement dated from the early years of the colony of South Australia, and the early forays into the hills were mainly to cut timber. The timber cutters were followed a few years later by would-be fortune seekers who came with the smell of, well, initially copper and later gold in their noses. I don't think too many made very much money out of it, but still. But this led on to what you might term permanent settlement. The arrival of timber cutters also coincided with the subdivision of some land, some Crown land, into sections, and that was offered for sale in the early 1840s. And there's still a few families in the district who are occupying land that was bought by their descendant, or by their antecedents, in the 1840s. There's only, to my knowledge, I think 3 families: the Brooks family at Piccadilly, the Giles family at Norton Summit, and the Playford family at Norton Summit, who are still on original land. There's lots of other families that have been there for a long time, but they're not on the same land. And I guess the Cobbeldicks at Uradla are one of those families. They're not far away, but they just don't own any of the original holding. So we saw this progression from being woodcutters, seasonal woodcutters, to buying land and establishing gardens and orchards. And I guess that's what East Torrens is best known for. It is a market gardening, orcharding area, growing crops such as cherries, apples, pears, stone fruit. And with changes over time, which I'll come back to, we're seeing vineyards coming into the area. I made a comment when I was asked to do this talk that researching the history of the district was about as difficult as getting around in it. Getting around in the district, I might add, a lot of the early settlers either came in from the plains or they came in through the Onkaparinga Valley via Mount Barker. I think because of the isolation, there wasn't a great deal recorded about the early years of the district. There was not a local paper, and that's obviously been a disadvantage. The Mount Barker Courier is the closest we've got, and their forays into East Torrens are pretty far and few between. A lot more now, but not last century and early this century. As far as written material goes, there's a couple of families who have done family histories. The Bungys, for example, have done one. The Spargos, the Bishops, needless to say, who wrote that one. Then in the early 1890s, there were 2 significant bits of work that were done on the district. One was by E.H. Hallock, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, there was a work called Toilers of the Hills. It was published in the Adelaide Register as a series of articles, and it was never published in book form. And in 1988, I think it was, the District Council of East Torrens covered the cost of actually publishing most of those articles. Hallock did a tour through the district by horseback, on foot and by buggy, and visited a lot of people. He recorded a lot of early history from people who were original settlers, and also made observations of what was happening in the district then and there. So it's a valuable record. One of the other early recorders from the early 1890s was George Sutherland, and I guess some of you may actually own a copy of his book called Our Inheritance in the Hills, and that covers not just East Torrens, but a lot of other areas in the Fleurieu Peninsula. 1937, Lucy Mayman Hines wrote a series of articles about East Torrens. I think there's about as much fact as there is, sorry, wrong way around, about as much fiction as there is fact in her articles. Still, there is some valuable material in them, but it takes a while to weed through what's apocryphal and what's correct, what's true. Newspaper articles were few and far between. Occasionally the Adelaide papers wrote about the hills. Probably the main source of information, which I found interesting for sure, was out of the gardening pages of the Observer and the Chronicle, and also the Garden and Field. And there were people like John Jennings from Norton Summit, and Charles Giles and John Pascoe, who wrote articles for those papers and that journal. The main source of material for the work that we've done in East Torrens has been primary sources, interviews with people, and I guess we were lucky enough to have started this when there were still people around the place who were born in the 1880s and 1890s. And as anyone who's done oral history, you know that every now and again you come across a real gem, and I've certainly talked to some people who have been excellent sources of information. There's also obviously government records, which have proved very important, and also some council records. We do have council records dating from actually before the formation of the council, which has been a valuable insight. There's certainly gaps in them, though. Whole decades have just disappeared, but what we have got is very valuable. And then more recently, as I said, some people have done family histories, and that has opened up other avenues of information. And a couple of years ago there was a heritage survey done of the area, and the two people who worked on that looked at aspects that hadn't been revealed before, both obviously from a built heritage point of view, the actual structures, and also the historical research that Robin Taylor did, and she concentrated quite a lot on the settlement patterns of the district, which hadn't been, well, I certainly hadn't analysed them to the degree that she did. History of Basket Range, tier on tier, is another local area that got filled in. And going over Forest Range, the actual Forest Range, to Forest Range in Lenswood. This was one I did before Tall as the Hills was tackled. Now, I made the comment before that there were links between these areas, and there still are a lot of family connections between Campbelltown and East Torrens, but also some connections with Lenswood, but not really as many. Most of the settlers in East Torrens were of Anglo-Saxon background. There are a couple of exceptions. There was a small German community in Third Creek in the 1850s, and the Lenswood area had quite a number of German families come into it. You know, obviously, if you move further east into the Onkaparinga and areas like Loberthal through to Harndorf, there are a lot more German families. Now, the nationality background tended to have been a dividing line. There are not many East Torrens families who are related to families at Lenswood, let alone Loberthal, Woodside, or further afield. Before we go to the slides, I'll just read you a quote. This is E.H. Halleck. I made the comment that East Torrens was very much a gardening district. And I guess any of you who know anything about market gardening, it's a very traditionally has been a very labour-intensive industry. And most market gardeners walk around like this most of their life. And as they get older, it gets even worse. Halleck made the observation, this is early 1890s, there was a high degree of overproduction of produce from the market gardening areas, and this was due to the lack of markets. Obviously it's perishable products, and you've got to get them to market fairly smartly. Intercolonial trade wasn't free at this stage, anything but, and a lot of what Halleck talks about in Tall as the Hills was whether people were free traders or protectionists. Did they believe in a commonwealth, if you like, of colonies or not? And they also talk a lot about processing of fruit. And I'll say a little bit about this in the slides. But he's got a rather nice quote here about the daily life of a market gardener. Their daily life is made up of hard, continuous and never-ending work. Pleasure is unknown to them. Digging, planting, irrigating, cutting, pulling, bunching, washing and loading their vegetables for the market occupies their time, and that of their families from 5 o'clock in the morning until 9 or 10 at night, when oftentimes either the gardener or his son mounts his cart, trolley or van and drives to town, oftentimes in a bitter cold and blinding rain, to be present at the opening of the market at 1 a.m. There he stands until 6 a.m. and occasionally 8 o'clock until all his wares are disposed of. Sometimes, as at this time, sales are made at unprofitable, if not ruinous prices. Then the search for a load of manure and the drive home frequently occupies him until 4 or 5 p.m. None but those who visit these toilers can form any idea of what the life of a hills gardener is, nor can an estimate be made formed by a casual visitor of the amount of produce he sends every week to the metropolis. Vans dragged by 4 horses laden to the heights of haystacks and continually containing 2.5 to 3 tons of vegetables and fruit roll along the hills highway 3 nights per week. The horses are as staunch as their owners, and how they haul such huge loads sometimes from almost inaccessible gullies is a matter of intense wonderment. Exceedingly puzzling it is to imagine, however, and whenever such immense quantities of vegetables are consumed, and a treatise by one of those philosophic tendencies entitled "The Tracks of the Cabbage from Planting to Consumption" would be both interesting and instructive. However, in spite of the hard work and long hours, there were a lot of gardeners in East Torrens who made quite a lot of money. And we'll go to the slides now and I'll show you some of what was happening. Okay, the Stringybark Forest. And it really was a forest. Some of the trees in the hills were quite immense, and a lot of this land obviously was cleared very early on for construction timber. As I was saying before, the nature of the country is up and down dale. This is Montacute, very steep country indeed. A lot of the quite wealthy early gardens were at Montacute, and I think it was because of the nature of the soil. It's a good red-brown loam. This is Lenswood, getting into flatter country at Lenswood, very much apple-growing country. Piccadilly Valley, this area was originally a swamp, probably no defined watercourse going through it, just an oozing of water through a tea tree and cutting grass swamp. Drained very early on. In fact, reputedly the first market gardener at Uraid at Piccadilly was a Mr. Champlin, and his property was virtually where we're looking, right in the centre of this area. This is actually cobbled, it's most of what you can see at the moment. The view of Piccadilly taken from Carmenay at Mount Lofty in the early 1930s. Same sort of pattern, market gardens on the flats and orchards on the hillsides. The township on the extreme left is Summertown. Cherries are probably the best known crop from East Torrens. Again, as you can see, grown on quite steep country. Apples, practices have changed, obviously. This is aerial spraying of apples, not done very often, I might add. And as I said before, with changing land use in the hills, we're now seeing more vineyards. This is Morialta. Road access was a major problem to the early settlers. The Greenhill Road, which is what we're looking at here, was built in 1856. Now, prior to that, there were a number of bullock tracks which got you into the hills. If you take this straight line, straight up over the top of that hill in the middle, that's where the original bullock track went, and that's over the top of Green Hill itself. Timber cutting remained a major occupation right through until the 1930s, probably even longer in the Lenswood area. Timber was used for both construction timber and also for fueling things that burnt timber, like brick kilns and bakeries and locomotives and so on. Stringy bark's a hardwood. It does very well in construction work, both as buildings and for things like jetties and the like. There were several timber milling companies that operated in the hills right through until the 1950s. Some of the poles, as they called them, that they were carting were anything up to 80 to 90 feet long. Now, these days you just can't find trees of that length in the hills, or that height. Because the area was hard to get through, road building was also a major dilemma, and a lot of people, as well as being gardeners, spent a lot of time either cutting timber or carting stone and doing roadworks. Here we have Thomas Trenorden, 1924, carting stone for roadworks. And this is a scene building the Gorge Road, 1917. You can see why people aren't employed these days. It just took so many people to do this sort of work. Well, what did they live in? I guess the range of dwellings in East Torrens was the same as most districts. You went from the humble, like this split timber hut, corrugated iron roof, probably replaced an earlier split shingle roof. This chap, incidentally, was a fellow called John Murdoch, and he was a family gardener to the Curnows at Montacute. Third Creek Road at McGill, again, a split timber construction house. So that's the bottom end of the scale, and there were some grand ones as well. And this is Grove Hill at Norton Summit, owned by the Giles family. From a historian's point of view, it's interesting to reflect on what's left. And again, like in a lot of districts, there's nothing much down the bottom end of the scale that has survived. Since this photograph was taken, the roof on this building has collapsed. So we're virtually seeing the end of the, what you might term, generic building styles in the hills. Here's the inside of another house at Basket Range. This house from the outside looks very much like a Cornish cottage. One of the more substantial houses built in the mid-1850s, built by a family called Presswood. It was, reputedly built as a hotel but never licensed. This house is right on the Greenhill Road, and it's recently been restored in very nice fashion. This is Biggs's Cottage on the main Lobethal Road, almost to Forest Range Ridge. This is on the State Heritage Register. Built in 1881 to 83 by John Biggs, and it was bought about 10 years ago now by the building inspector for East Torrens Council, who also happened to be a stonemason. This is part of the Brooks property at Piccadilly, also on the State Register. One of the few remaining early farmsteads that are in the district. On the extreme right you have an original slab cottage, which I believe is not as old as what you may think it is. to the best of our knowledge, it was built early this century, but in a style that reflected 50 years earlier. The building with the artistic rusty roof is a very early cold store. It has a sprinkler system on top, and the water virtually works like an evaporative cooling bag. The inside walls were hung with hessian. In the background is the second house, if you like, built in 2 or 3 stages, part split timber, part stone, and part what the council records called Egyptian brick, which is really either rammed earth or mud brick construction. And there was another house, which is out of the photograph, which was number 3, if you like, and there's also number 4. Number 3 got knocked down a few years ago, so they wanted some stone to fill some holes in the road. But, as I say, one of the few surviving early farmsteads. Early orcharding, Vince's property at Summertown. A lot of the early properties were real Chinese gardens, if you like. Orchard and market garden. They also grew berry crops. Quite often, as the trees were maturing, they'd grow berry crops between the trees, or rhubarb. The vegetables were usually left for the best alluvial flats, for obvious reasons, and the orchards were on the hill slopes. This is the Bishop property at Basket Range, taken on the 13th of August 1889. This shows very well the young fruit trees with the probably rhubarb growing between them. Most of the gardening work was done by hand or by horse, and the horses were literally part of the family, and I guess that's the case with most farmers who used horse power. That horse was called Jack, by the way. Here we have some gardeners from Uradla dressed up in their wet weather gear. They wore leather leggings to keep their feet and legs dry. Here we are washing potatoes by hand, and I think if you went out to Virginia and showed this to people like Vic Zarella, he wouldn't recognise what they're doing. The scale of operation has changed so much. These people were small producers of lots and lots of different crops, and that was part of making a living. If you could supply everything from carrots to potatoes to cabbages and then into the fruit lines, you'd make a go of it. But if you were a huge potato grower in a small market in those days, you'd probably be pushing to make a go of things. So hand washing potatoes and bagging them. This is washing parsnips. Put the parsnips in a hessian sack and wash them in a hole in the ground. In actual fact, they were spraying coloured water. No, what they were doing was trying to work out how effective it was to spray apple trees from the air. And what they did was put on coloured marker, which they could actually visibly see on the trees, and try and work out whether it was as effective as using a ground level boom sprayer. It wasn't, so they didn't do it. I can come back later, if you like, in a question to practices in gardens, as they have changed, and they are changing all the time. There were people in the district who grew things other than vegetables and apples. This is Walker's Violet Farm. This is going to market mid-1920s, the days when motor trucks started to take over from horse and carts. And I've had comments from a number of the older people from the district that going to market in the early hours of the morning in one of these things was about as bad as going with horse and cart. At least the horse knew where it was going. And here you have a generation plant that's run by dynamo, I presume, and the faster you get, the brighter the lights were. The slower you went, the less lights you had. And quite often, this chap was saying to me that you'd have to walk in front of the lantern to actually show them where you're going. There are a few people in the district who still have trucks and machinery that dated from the early motorised period of gardening. There were people in the area who continued to use horse teams right up until the late 50s. I don't recall it, but my father talks about the horse mills at Basket Range who still used to use a 4-horse team taking goods to market as late as about 1957, and they were the last ones in the district. The Horsnell sold their property a few years ago and moved to Birdwood, and Clive Horsnell now has a Clydesdale stud. So it's been a lifetime association with horses. And then to market. And markets were, the market on East Terrace was a very busy place. And for any of you who ever visited it when it was still working, it was quite a fascinating place. And the growers who now go out to Paracas said it just doesn't have the same feel. Norton Summit. The reason I'm going to throw in some slides about some of the townships is that one thing that Robin Taylor came up with, and I had suspected, was that there are no government towns in East Torrens. There's not a single surveyed government town. They've all just developed, just happened. People, for whatever reason, built, say, a hotel or a hitching water post for horses, and buildings built up around it. Seneca Hotel at Norton Summit with St John's Church in the background. Norton Summit today, the building on the right is the old council chambers, built in 1902, and the Seneca Hotel on the left. A lot of the buildings that were in the earlier slide have actually been demolished. And council continued to use that building until 1982. And, you know, like most country districts, why do you need a new council chambers? The present one's perfect, isn't it? And towards the end, the council workers would have to pack up their desks and all their belongings in order to hold a council meeting. That's how small the building is. One of the well-known families from Norton Summit are the Playfords. This is the original homestead, or this is where Sir Thomas Playford was born. The homestead wasn't built by the Playfords, it was built by the Greenham family, and this building called Primrose Vale still stands. This photograph was actually taken during World War II, and the people in it are Land Army women, who, as you're probably aware, did a lot of work on primary production properties during the war period. Ashton, the general store, and the Racabite Hall. Summertown, the big building in the background is the Mount Lofty Hotel, and in front of that's the store. And if you went across the road where those carts are, that was Lou Kost's blacksmith shop. And the pile of wood down in the corner was Percival's timber mill. So they were very much self-contained little towns. People did most of their shopping locally. Uradler at one stage had 5 small shops in it where you could buy various sorts of provisions. Today it's got 1. This is Summertown, again a small township, probably the most compact of the townships as far as houses and services go. Right on the right-hand side you see a 2-storey barn-looking building. Those of you who know Summertown at all, that's the building that Milton Moon has been using as his pottery for the last 20 years. The store at Summertown had a guy who did local deliveries, Mr Harris, and he was something of a local legend, mainly through his friendly nature and complete inefficiency. Some of the stories I've heard are just extraordinary. He used to deliver as far as Forest Range, which by horse and cart would be almost a 2-hour round trip. And it'd be nothing to be 5 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. He was still out at Forest Range somewhere doing his rounds. And he did everything. If you had a clock that wasn't working, you'd give it to him, he'd take it off and get it fixed. He delivered almost any sorts of goods. He acted as a local postman. Just, you know, that sort of, you might call it good old friendly family service. The store at Summertown also had a bakery attached to it, and here we have the baker and his assistant, and the owner of the store, who, I guess in the what are you talking about here, late 30s, I don't know, Ford Mercury or something or other. And there were a number of blacksmith shops in the district, obviously with a number of horses around. There was a big call for blacksmiths. This was Farham's, or Fareham. They were one of 3 different blacksmiths at Summertown. There were 2 at Uradler, and there was 1 at Norton Summit. And there were also blacksmiths at McGill and Campbelltown that the locals used. This is Uradler, probably the oldest photograph we have of the township, taken somewhere in the early 1890s. The building in the background is the Institute, and right next to it is St Stephen's Church, built in 1892. Well, obviously it's not in the photograph. The building in front of the Institute is the hotel, built in the 1860s, and on the extreme left of the photograph, the 2-storey building is what is now the Aristologist restaurant, and at one stage was a bakery and store. I'm going to move on and talk about, in passing, a few of the families. There's a couple of quotes I was going to read before I go on to those. I've picked out at random a few figures from East Torrens. Now this first one is Christopher Moulds, and if you're going to write a history of East Torrens, you could virtually do it through the Moulds family. They're related to almost everybody, including the bishops. Christopher, known as Kit Moulds, and his wife Nancy. They were early settlers at Ashton, and as I mentioned before, large family, owned quite a lot of land around the district. The worker of the family was Nancy. Christopher had rather a strong liking for stuff that came out of bottles, and she was really the mainstay of the family. And you notice this quite a lot in the hills, not the fact that the man drank and the wife worked, but the fact that the women quite often ran both the family and the garden. And that quote before from Halleck will probably tell you why. There's largely the men were involved in going to market. Down to Montacute, this is on the Corkscrew Road, and the red roof down below is the Trebilco homestead, and their neighbours were people called Curnow. Now, there were some interesting people in East Torrens, people who had very accomplished horticultural backgrounds, and Joseph Curnow was one of them. He bought what was Bailey's Garden at Hackney and operated a nursery there for quite some years. He went broke, along with a lot of other people, in the 1850s, and eventually bought land at Montacute, where he developed what became one of the finest orchards in the district. He had, at one stage, 120 acres of fruit trees, which is a big property. Even now, 100 acres of fruit trees is a lot of trees. There was quite a strong agricultural bureau movement in the district from the late 80s, early 90s, and people like Curnow and Giles and the Jennings families were all active in that. And there was quite a strong association with people who were involved in horticulture on the Adelaide Plains. Figures like, or in earlier period, Schomburg and some of the other Botanic Garden people, and some of the famous nursery people like the Hackett brothers were all involved in this network of people who were interested in growing things. This is the Burdettes from Basket Range, William and Martha Burdett. Their interest in horticulture went the next step. Halleck was talking about the need for orderly marketing of fruit, and one of the initiatives that came out of all this was the establishment of the East End Market Company. The Burdettes, along with the Cowlings from Norton Summit and the Playford family, were three of the main driving forces behind that market. The Burdettes' other claim to fame, they were probably the biggest cherry growers in Adelaide Hills until the 1955 bushfires completely destroyed the property and they didn't replant. And in the 1920s, following on this strong interest in horticulture, they joined people like Ashby's from Blackwood and started growing South African native plants. And the Burdett native plant shrubbery at the Basket Range is a legacy from that period. It's an area of about probably 10 hectares, a bit less, completely planted out with Australian and South African native plants. As I said before, Halleck did the rounds of the district and talked to a lot of people. And needless to say, his presence created a bit of interest amongst the locals, and I'll just read you this paragraph. My visit to the next proprietor, Mr. Thomas Sharp, was afterwards the occasion of much trouble to him. When I left him and his good lady, who was present during the interview, they compared notes, and the conviction beset them, as it had many others, that I was an officer of the taxation department. And I had come for the purpose of raising their land tax. After mutually agreeing that they were fools to have given me all the information I had obtained from them, it was decided that the old gentleman should go and find out what I was up to. Consequently, next day he went all the way to Uradla and then to Summertown and waited until my return in the evening for the purpose of being fortified with my assurance that I was not, quote, one of them beggarly blood-sucking officials. In the same district, he visited another very early settler, and I made the comment that in 1892 a lot of the very early settlers were still living, and the one he visited was Mr. George White. On the return trip from here, I was strongly advised to call and pay my respects to one of the oldest, if not the oldest, certainly the most versatile, residents of the hills. I refer to Mr. George White, who arrived in the colony on the brig the Emma, Captain Nelson from Hobart in 1837. His age is 71 years. It intrigues me that quite often this comment comes up in his writings that these people were aged, and I guess it's reflecting the hard life that at 71 he was an old man. He is 71 years of age and he is remarkably active considering his hard work and varied experiences. On arrival in Adelaide, he was apprenticed to a carpenter but disliked the business. He absented himself without leave and came to the Tiers to cook for timber splitters. With the exception of a slight intermission when he was working at Encounter Bay on the whale fisheries, he's lived here ever since. Introduced to him by my companion, and his companion for these trips was Robert Cobbledick, he was asked to come under a grateful shade of a cowshed. This he declined, inviting us inside his comfortable home, quote, as he didn't like speaking to a gentleman in a pigsty. Asked as to his early experiences here, he remarked, quote, that he knows quite a good bit, but sometimes his memory's a bit tumbled down. Observing that notes were being taken, he remarked, What you got there, young fellow? Writing a cheque, eh? If so, write it out for 50 and I'll let you down easy and draw £5 a month. His conversational powers were exhibited in much the same strain for some little time. In bidding him goodbye, he asked, "You going to Adelaide?" "Yes." "Well, if you see the governor, give him my best respects and ask him to send me a few of them Carnarvons that fall from his table." "What are Carnarvons?" "Why, a leg of roast turkey and a bit of ham. That's what I call Carnarvons." Social life in East Torrens, I'll just quickly go through a few areas that were, I guess, form the social structure of the district. The earliest churches in the district were of the nonconformist background, and this was mainly due to the presence of the Reverend Thomas Playford, who used to preach from a private house in Norton Summit, and the outcome of this was the Grassy Flat Chapel, which was always a non-denominational chapel. The next church that was built was a direct result of that, and that was the Baptist Church, and this is still one of the strongest churches in the district. I mentioned earlier the Bungay family. A number of the Bungay family have been ministers or pastors in the Baptist Church, and of course the Playfords are strong supporters of the Baptist Church. St John's Anglican, built in 1872, and this was largely funded through the Baker family of Morialta. Morialta was one of the biggest estates in the district, and that's something I didn't mention earlier. When I said that land was being sold in the 1840s and 50s, a lot of land was taken up by investors, people who never lived in the district and probably very rarely, if ever, visited the area. One of the big estates was the Baker property, which was originally owned by, and I think this is rather nice, C.D.E. Fortnum. He actually was C.D. Fortnum, and he added an E to his name, so it became C.D.E. And he was one of the Fortnums of Fortnum and Mason, and he owned the Morialta property until the Bakers bought it in 1845, built a grand mansion there. It was something like 2,500 acres and was part of a large pastoral empire. They had land in various parts of the state. Well, they bequeathed St John's Church, and members of the family were active in it right up until about 1913, when Morialta was sold. The other church groups that were very strong, probably the strongest in the district, were what became the Methodist churches. There were several Bible Christian chapels. In fact, I think there were 3 Bible Christian chapels and one Methodist. What was the Ashton one? Was that Wesleyan? That's right, yeah. What's missing? There were no Roman Catholic churches in the district, and I guess that reflected the background of the people who settled in the area. Schools. There were schools from the private schools from the 1850s, 60s, and government schools, of course, built over the next 20, 30 years. This one's Basket Range in 1903. And there were schools at Norton Summit, Uradla, Cherryville and Montacute. At the present time, there's still 3 schools left in the district, which is something of a remarkable feat. Some of them have got very, very close to being closed. The area is just too close to Adelaide. This is a school fife band from Basket Range. War service, obviously something that's in people's minds this year, the World War II. This is actually a World War I memorial, the Women's Memorial Gates at the Summertown Cemetery. And as Australia Remembers project, the East Torrens Council are going to restore these gates and put in a memorial to World War II as well. Australia Day 1916, this was one of the fundraising exercises for World War I, but Australia Day was regularly marked through the district by processions. I'm not quite sure. I think this one's the British Empire. You can see Britannia there with the pronged fork, and I guess the guy in the sailor's uniform's George V. Sporting events. This is the Basket Range cricket team in 1894. This is an orchestra of some sort. A brass band, that's the word, yeah, from Summertown, 1920s. And this, of course, was the period where institutes were very active, and we've recently been having a look at the literary societies that existed in East Torrens. I knew of 2, we've now got up to 5 that existed during that period, 1890 to about 1940. And along with that were other forms of entertainment which kept people amused. And there was also an amateur theatrical society at Summertown. This was actually run by the wife of the chap who owned the store. I'm going to finish up with a few comments about where's East Torrens going. There was a question I asked in the preamble to this talk, and I'll ask you the question and see if you can tell me the answer. If you can't, I'll answer it myself. But before I do that, East Torrens in the last 30 years has changed a lot. There are relatively few families left there who were there 40 years ago. The area has seen a huge number of houses built through the area, and in many ways it's becoming an outer suburb of Adelaide. An awful lot of people commute daily to Adelaide to work. I'm guilty of that myself. I don't actually live in East Torrens, but the land values have gone through the roof, and it's got to the stage where orcharding and market gardening is no longer a viable exercise in East Torrens. And I suspect in the next 10 years we'll see virtually no gardening, productive land use going on in East Torrens. I think as a family we'd probably give ourselves another decade. We don't like the thought, but I reckon in 10 years' time we'll have to seriously think about selling, because we can't afford to keep the place. If you're sitting on land that's worth probably $2.5 million, what do you do with it? And I'm afraid growing apples doesn't pay the bills. So scenes such as this, which is to me the essence of the Central Hills, this is autumn on our own property, just won't last, I'm afraid, and we're going to lose a very valuable asset, both from a productivity point of view and also the produce that's grown in the area. And I guess after 120 odd years of cherry growing, we've got a rather soft spot for growing cherries, even though we curse the seasons every year and the birds. So I'll finish on that point. And the last thing, before I ask the question, I brought these in. 1985, Lenswood Cold Stores celebrated their 50th anniversary, and a group of us got together a collection of fruit. And on display we had 65 varieties of apples. You think about what you can buy in a shop these days. 5, 6, 7 varieties, and they're all quite predictable. And it really brought home to a number of us of the genetic stock that's been lost through whims of market, and really fruit growing like winemaking is affected by the whims of markets. And more people, well, there's a number of people in the hills who are now starting to collect bits and pieces of old varieties. And some of the old apple varieties have got an awful lot going for them. In essence, a lot of them got thrown out because they weren't suitable for long keeping, there wasn't cold storage, and they gradually narrowed down to fruit that would last a long time. And you look at apple varieties, and some of you will probably remember them. Varieties like Rokewood, which are hard as a block of wood. They don't go off though. You can't eat them, but they sure last. and when you think that things like Rokewood were exported to Great Britain as deck cargo, now that just shows you how well they keep. It's a beautiful looking apple, I'll give them that. But anyway, I guess all I'm trying to say is there is a need to conserve that genetic resource that was grown in the hills for so long. There still are a few orchards around that are growing varieties that have long since gone off the market shelves. Here we have a variety of pear, known colloquially as the pound pear, and in correct terms it's a variety called Uvedale St Germain. It's a cooking pear, and it will last out of refrigeration, or just in a cool room, for about 9 months. And you can see the advantages of growing stuff like that. The cost of keeping them was minimal, and you had fresh fruit that lasted right through, almost until the next season started. And that was very common. People grew umpteen varieties of apples, and they started at Christmas time and went right through to May. In fact, there's a variety of apples that was grown in the hills called June eating, and I'm not quite sure whether it was still edible in June or whether they're picking in June. I doubt they'd be picking in June though. Granny Smith is about the last one we pick, and that's early May. This other little thing, I don't know what it is. It was given to me tonight by someone, and it's a member of the same family. It's a member of the rosaceous family. So size is variable. I'll finish up with a question. I'll ask you the question, see if you can tell me the answer. What have George Milner Stephen, Samuel Allen and William Wotton in common? It's probably an unfair question. We'll start with the easy one. Who's George Milner Stephen? Spot on. Yep. George Milner Stephen was the acting governor, as Norris just said, between Hindmarsh and Gawler. He was also married to Hindmarsh's daughter. And I find him a fascinating individual, and I'll come back to that in a minute. What these three people have in common is they were all timber cutters. They were all timber millers, rather. George Milner Stephen owned a timber mill at Woodhouse, probably the earliest steam-driven sawmill in the Adelaide Hills. Samuel Allen was one of those elusive characters of the hills, and I don't know very much about him at all, except we do know he existed. He had a timber mill or timber cutting place at Basket Range, and William Watton was actually the grandfather of David Watton, and they operated a timber mill at Summertown until about 5 years ago. Why does George Milner Stephen intrigue me? I think he's one of these figures who, if you had the time to do it, you could write quite an interesting biography of the man. I first came across him when I was doing a management plan for Port Gawler Conservation Park. It was in 1838-39. He was involved in some rather shady land dealings there with Mary Hindmarsh, the governor's wife. And they got trundled, is that right? Trumbled over it. The next occasion I came across him was when I was working on the Forest Range history. In 1854, there was a gold rush at Stony Creek. This came out of the exodus of people to Victoria to the goldfields, and the government offered a reward for someone who could find a reasonable find of gold or any precious metals in South Australia. And lo and behold, Stony Creek popped up, and guess who was behind it? George Milner Stephen. They planted gold there, didn't they? And then I came across him operating the sawmill at Woodhouse, and it immediately passed through my mind, perhaps cruelly, I wonder what he was up to this time. But he was an interesting man. He left South Australia, went to the Hunter Valley, where he became almost a fortune teller. He adopted some fairly unusual religious beliefs, and became a faith healer. That's right. In between leaving South Australia and ending up in the Hunter, he'd been to England and taken his Master of Law degree. So he was an interesting guy. And I will leave it there. Thank you. It's a bit beyond me to tell you much about that. I think there were two companies that operated at the East End Market, and they've both operated until very recently. Hamish might be able to tell you more than I can. There was the Newmarket Company and the East End Market Company, and I think they both, the Newmarket, I think I'm right, owned the Botanic Hotel in that precinct, and that was sold to some West Australian group, I think, well, the hotel was, some years ago, and the East End Market Company survived until they sold and moved to Paraka. And the families who had been involved in setting it up still had quite strong holdings in it at that time. The question that was asked is, to what extent are vineyards and winemaking taking over land use in the hills? Quite a large degree. I think it's still at the stage where there's not too many primary producers growing grapes. A lot of the people who are growing grapes are hobby farmers who've got money behind them, or they're winery people. And that's where the money is in the wine business, making the stuff, not growing the grapes. From a land management point of view, it's good. There's a lot of the Piccadilly valleys going under grapes, and of course they're not cultivating anymore, so the loss of topsoil there's being slowed down enormously. And a lot of the market gardeners are actually moving out to broader, flatter areas like Nairn and Forest and South East and so on. I guess it depends how you define residential. I'm talking larger than quarter-acre allotments. Yeah, but there is minimum subdivision sizes, and there's a lot of existing titles in the hills, and we'll probably see more people subdivide down to that minimum. And of course planning regulations do change too through pressure. I think probably the watershed factor is the one that's going to hold it more than anything else. The NWS have been very strong on the quality of water that's heading into Mount Bold and down to Kangaroo Creek. So I think that factor will keep them at bay to some extent. But in essence what we're seeing is people buying allotments, whether it's a small 1 acre block which already exists or a 30 hectare block, and using it as a hobby farm come rural retreat. And as far as productive agriculture goes, it's minimal. And that's what's happening. I guess we saw a similar thing happen with the Torrens Valley and with the Sturt River area. But of course that was close subdivision. Yeah.